in a Jeep. You're right. The sergeant rides in a truck. You're right. The general rides in a limousine, but we're just out of luck. You're right. You ain't got nothing to worry.
Please, and especially like if you have some veterans, friends or something, we'd like them to see our veteran displays. So thank you very much. And Paul Birgy is going to take over. We're very grateful to have him here. So thank you, Paul.
More than
It's
welcome.
all yours.
Thank you. Good
Paul,
evening.
Do you want this light off?
That's perfectly fine on if everybody's good with that. So my name is Paul Birgy. Many of you I know, some of you I do not, but pleasure to meet your acquaintance. I grew up in Fife Lake. I love everything that the Historical Society is doing. I'm going to get emotional already because growing up here, that stuff really didn't exist. There was, parts and pieces and things, but we never really had exposure to that growing up. You knew what you knew, and you knew who you knew, and as we all age and get older, those are things that you come to appreciate. So, speaking of the tank tonight, growing up, Birgy family, very large. One of my uncles was a tank commander and served under General Patton in World War II. He was in the Battle of the Bulge as well. So that was always kind of one of my idols growing up. Birgy reunion always was every year at the Legion Hall in South Boardman, and again playing on the tank and just appreciating it. And then as I got older, the tank aged, and it was redone and refurbished back in 2006, and they converted it aesthetically into a marine tank. And I just always had aspirations and ultimately wanted to redo the tank back to original spec. So as I got involved in the Legion, I am our post commander for Sons of American Legion at the South Boardman Post. I've been that for 21 years. And as I got involved with the Legion and learned more about our history and the tank's history, there were a lot of gaps. And so I not only wanted to learn about the tank, I wanted to learn about Ford's program. I wanted to refurbish it back to spec. And so there's just a culmination of things. It literally took me 4.5 years to get to the point where I could actually refurbish the tank. A lot of things to go through. So what we're going to talk about tonight, Ford actually received a contract from the government to develop a new motor for the tanks because at the time they were using Continental aircraft engines. Very large, very hot, diesel, et cetera, et cetera. So when you think about tanks being on the combat field, diesel was just something that they wanted to move away from. So what we're going to do is we're going to watch a 6-minute video that we put together based around the motor itself of how Ford got the contract and what happened with the motor through the years. Then what we're going to do is I'm going to break down, there's a PowerPoint presentation that I put together with Ford. It's about 27 slides. We're going to talk about, get into the details of what Ford was doing for the military, for the country during both World War I and World War II. Ford actually had a program called In the Service of America, and that's what we're going to dive into. To wrap up, then, I'm going to talk about the specifics of our tank. So, without further ado, we'll watch this video. I would like to also thank Beck Birgy. Beck graduated a couple years ago from Kalkaska. He went to school in Grand Rapids, phenomenal with film, video, editing, and things of that nature. So when I was working on this project, his grandmother was a Legion member, is an auxiliary member, and so I wanted to keep as many connections and utilize our resources, and so this was put together from Beck. And the footage you're going to see in here was provided to me from Ford. At the time, these were never before seen images of the motor and things that Ford never released to the public. Up until now.
Welcome to the South Boardman American Legion Hall. Today is a historic event, as this is the 1942 Ford M4A3 Sherman Tank rededication ceremony. We take a look at the development history and features of an engine that powered the M4 Sherman and other vehicles. Starting life before World War II as a 27-liter V12 designed for aviation purposes, the Ford GAA would eventually becoming a world-class V8 for both military and civilian purposes. It was originally designed as a V-12 on request from Henry Ford. Anticipating the start of another World War, Ford set about designing an engine better than any competing designs. The Tank Corps were in need of a V8 to power their Sherman tanks, so Ford were approached to resolve the problem of engine supply. Ford removed 4 cylinders from the unused V12 casting cores to make an 18-liter V8. To speed up assembly and supply of this new engine, they simply retained the same design from the V12, keeping the 60-degree angle and its all-aluminum construction. The Ford GAA, the largest petrol V8 in history, was born. For its time, the GAA was a marvel of engineering. Due to its military role, it had no belts or chains whatsoever. Everything was gear-driven for durability and to reduce maintenance. There was a power divider to drive the cams, distributors, and pumps. A rare sight on engines at the time, its spark plugs were located centrally in the combustion chamber, allowing for a more complete detonation of fuel. It was a true double overhead cam engine with 2 exhaust valves and 2 inlet valves per cylinder. A 198 pounds flywheel was used to smooth out the firing order of the huge engine. The GAA's capabilities were regarded as underused powering tanks, never being properly pushed to its limits in this role. The name Sherman comes from the British tradition of naming its American-produced tanks after American Civil War generals. Named after General William Tecumseh Sherman, the name quickly caught on in the United States, which soon adopted the practice of naming all its tanks after generals. The Sherman tank was the most commonly used American tank in World War II. More than 50,000 Shermans were produced between 1942 and 1945. They were used in all combat theaters. The Sherman tank's primary role was infantry support, spearheading attacks as well as bolstering defensive positions. As America's most produced tank, the needs of the U.S. Army outmatched the production capabilities of a single plant. To meet the demand, multiple plants put the Sherman into production, but with variations in design both due to manufacturing capabilities and different needs in the field. The M4A3 was initially produced exclusively by Ford, until it dropped out of tank production, giving it a V8 engine and a welded hull. This subdenomination became the preferred U.S. Army tank, but it also served the French and Nicaraguan armies in small numbers. Now for you to hear the incredible sound of the Ford GAA 18-liter V8 engine. After the war ended, thousands of units saw civilian use in various fields including oil extraction, transport, and agriculture. It was during these years that people began tinkering with it and uncovering its true potential. With minor modifications such as the addition of forced induction, its initial output doubled, while when stronger pistons, direct fuel injection, and a more refined valve train were combined with a turbo or a supercharger, the GAA could reliably produce more than 2,000 horsepower. Now, 82 years old, this Titan was overshadowed in terms of popularity by other Ford the 5.8 developed during the golden age of muscle cars, but, in terms of performance potential, reliability, and size, it remains unrivaled. The American-made Ford Sherman tank will live in history as the most efficiently produced and most reliable tank on the battlefield. Thank you for attending the South Boardman American Legion Hull Sherman Tank rededication ceremony, and special thanks to the Ford Motor Company for making all of this possible.
So when we did our rededication last September, it was actually last Labor Day, again, all of this footage that you're going to see today, and we talked about it, never been released to the public. I can only have, with the median here, I can only have one thing open at a time, so I apologize. So as I mentioned, Ford's involvement, and there's a lot of content we're going to cover here that's just fascinating of everything that Ford was doing. It'll give you a true appreciation, and it was mentioned in the video, of really how involved Ford was with the military, with the war effort, but also with modernization. We really won the war because of what we were able to do with assembly and manufacturing and getting things there. And, you know, there was a saying that was a kind of a slang term that very, very popular during this era, and it was a kind of a theme throughout America of keep them rolling. And people took pride. I mean, it was a different America back then, and it was all about getting everything that we could to the front lines. So there's a lot of great stuff we're going to talk about here. So, as I mentioned, it took me about 4.5 to 5 years to do all of this stuff. And when I first took the initiative, and I figured, okay, I'll just reach out to Ford, and they're going to think this is cool, and you know, get somebody about. It took me 1.5 years to get in front of somebody at Ford. And when I did, they said, well, yeah, there's a new archive program that we're doing and establishing, and those are the guys you need to talk to. So again, it took me a while to get in front of them because this was all brand new. So the archive, so to speak, is something that is live, and we're going to talk about that towards the end here. But the archive team consists of 6 full-time archivists, 7 part-time indexers, plus a director. He's the director of the heritage and the brand for Ford. Their whole goal was to preserve the history and the brand, plus create access for internal and external purposes. At this facility, and getting rolling, there was 16,000 cubic feet of paper, 3 miles of shelving, nearly 3 million negatives, 50,000 moving images, 3,000 artifacts, 1,000 pieces of art, and tens of thousands of born digital files. That's what they were working with. That's why I couldn't get in front of anybody. So, and what was kind of cool, Ford actually celebrated their 150th anniversary last year. They were working to put together down in Detroit a huge event, and their goal was to have one vehicle from every class of manufacturing that they'd ever done. And when I finally got in front of them, the brand manager was just purely ecstatic, and they were literally talking about hiring basically a moving company. And Ford works with, they do this stuff all over the country, so they had a company that they actually work with. But they were going to come up and literally pick up our tank, take it to Detroit for presentation, then bring it back. Because of budgets and all they were trying to do, if you think of that many cars over 150 years, or I shouldn't say cars, vehicle classes, because they do emergency response, they've done military, they've done all kinds of stuff. So it didn't come to fruition, but it was pretty cool that Ford was going to come up here and move our tank. And I will tell you, that raised it ruffled a lot of feathers, because people take pride in that tank. There was a lot of skepticism of, would Ford bring it back? I'm going to talk about reasons why when I get into the rest of this. So, Ford's leadership in the arsenal of democracy. In many aspects, and throughout this presentation, as I mentioned, you'll see that the World War II, numerous aspects of World War II was really won because of the factory floor. Ford Motor Company's mass production know-how was a critical key to the Allied victory. Ford helped the Allies win the war by helping to develop and produce Jeeps. They were the first ones to develop Jeeps. Building of the B-24 bomber at the Willow Run plant, And by mobilizing for the demands of war, utilizing Ford's mass production facilities in Detroit. And then we're going to talk about three, it's interesting, there's three main plants down there, but there's a lot of things that encompass. It was almost like their own entity down in Detroit at that time. So the aircraft building at the Rouge complex. Henry Ford announced in May of 1940 that Ford could soon build 1,000 planes per day. So think of 1940, you think of our resources, the amount of people, technology, and he says to the entire country, we can build 1,000 planes per day. However, he also stated that he would only build the planes if they were used for national defense. So as part of this plan, and at this point there was a Ford UK. Ford UK built what's called the Rolls-Royce Merlin aircraft engine. That was already in motion at the time. But again, it was a tedious process to build these. So they were building them over there for the Royal Air Force and the U.S. Army Air Corps. So Ford ultimately, and you're going to hear this reoccurringly throughout my presentation, they redrew the blueprints for the Merlin engine, making it more suitable for mass production. And by 1944, over 400 engines per week were flowing out of the UK plant. That's, again, just crazy. So as part of this, there was the initiative, there was a new aircraft building extension at the Rouge plant, which you see here to the, in the picture. By August of 1941, Ford was producing huge 18-cylinder Pratt & Whitney aircraft engines, and by 1941, Ford produced its first tank parts. So when we think about World War II, one of the first things that come to mind is either usually Hitler, Germany, Nazis, Pearl Harbor. Pearl Harbor, I mean, that's, for us, that's what kick-started it. At the time that Pearl Harbor was bombed, in 1939, production for military readiness really hadn't started yet. You know, we were intrigued by the war, but we hadn't been stepped on. So up until that moment, the U.S. was not fully mobilized for war or even national defense. Pearl Harbor is what realistically shocked the U.S. into full-bore military production. So full mobilization at the Ford plants. Ford, the company that put the world on wheels, began preparations to win a war and ratcheted up to a 7-day production week on December 12th of 1941. And again, people worked hard back then, but also people didn't work every day in manufacturing plants. That demand wasn't there like it is today. That was, you know, Sundays at home, and you know, you worked on the farm, you worked at home, you did stuff at the house. So this was new. Ford produced its last passenger car on February 10th, 1942, a month before the U.S. government deadline for ending civilian production took place. Ford then focused all of its industrial might on ensuring Allied victory. There were three major Detroit Dearborn area plants: the Rouge Complex, the Highland Park, and the Lincoln plants, which were all on the west side of Detroit. These became totally available for full-scale military production. The Ford U.S. war effort was not confined to the Detroit area facilities, though. They encompassed and included Ford's 16 other U.S. manufacturing plants and parts distribution operations. So again, think back to the 1940s. Ford already had 16 facilities in the United States, and as we progress, you're going to see they actually had them all over the world at that point. So other Ford resources included the Dearborn Laboratory, facilities on the Village Road, coal and iron mines, tracks of sturdy timber, sawmills, the Ford fleet of freighters, and steel and glass factories at the Rouge Complex as well. Ford's U.S. effort also included the Village Industries in Michigan, which were 18 small parts plants located in Michigan towns like Flat Rock, Northville, Waterford, Manchester. Many of these plants had the capability to also generate their own hydropower. So again, very, very advanced. There was amazing that, you know, Ford took such pride in this. Ford's employment went from 123,000 people in January of 1942 to about 204,000 people in November of 1943. And of that employment ratio, 30% were female. Ford used the same assembly method that had worked for them since the Model T, when they scaled up for military production. Instead of using general purpose tools, which required a great deal of effort to make, you know, each of the individual parts, Ford developed specialized tools which could then complete specific tasks more efficiently. The result was that those precision parts could be made faster and better, and this became more of just a concept for Ford. It became their way of life. As we spoke, or as you watched in the video, in 1940, Ford engineers at the Dearborn facility began working on a new aircraft engine design. The U.S. Army was asked Ford and presented with them to adapt that design for their medium-sized tanks. So you're going to hear talk about the M4. Prior to the M4, you had the M1, the M3. As we get into things, those tanks were way more rounded, curved, and very, very rough. So there's a few things that'll come into play with suspension and the design of these tanks as we progress. After 18 months of research and development at Ford's expense, Ford set up a production line at the Lincoln plant in Detroit and began making a new advanced Superb tank engine. Over the course of the war, Ford produced almost 27,000 of these engines. In 1940, the Army signed a contract with Ford, and then they began full production under Ford. At that time, there were other manufacturers involved too. Ford built almost 1,700 Sherman tanks, as well as more than 1,000 M10 tanks and almost 13,000 armored cars. Rouge engineers devised a way to make the armored plating with water-cooled dyes, and you heard about that a little bit in the video, which eliminated warping and cut production time from 2 hours to 8 minutes in 1940.
Wow.
So as a result, 12 previous steps were gone. Universal carriers. Altogether, Ford produced, hold on just a second here, I'm sorry. You see some of these vehicles here. These are, this is at the Chicago assembly. These are M20 armored cars. A lot of advertising back then that really, again, spoke to American pride. We were pulling from people's emotions, things of that nature. The B-24 Liberator. A lot of people don't realize that Ford manufactured these, and they did a lot of them. So Ford produced approximately 8,700 B-24s, which equated to nearly half of the total built for the U.S. military during World War II. For one innovation involving the center wing, Ford reduced a job of 36 men in 1,500 hours to 3 men in 24 minutes. The Ford B-24 Liberator bombers were produced at the Willow Run facility, and it became the symbol of American invention and teamwork. It was a huge factory that aimed to produce victory and rose out of the southeastern Michigan flatlands. This is kind of interesting. When you think of wartime and very industrial settings, it was also very glamorous. Ford was doing a lot of things to get the attention of not only the general public, but of everybody. So the famous aviator, Charles Lindbergh, was actually part of the plant team. He was there almost daily from April 3rd of 1942 onward. He did flight testing and experimentation on a lot of the B-24s and other associated components and implements. Famous politicians and royalty came to visit the Willow Run facility, including Irving Berlin. And at the time, Irving Berlin was a famous American songwriter. In his lifetime, Berlin helped shape the evolution of that genre through his use and adaptation of a variety of styles, and he actually wrote and is credited for over 800 songs before his death. So, again, to see that type of people touring an automotive facility, it was a big deal back then. So Willow Run, they said it could not be done. And with government support, Ford began building the Willow Run plant on about 1,750 acres on former farmland near the village of Willow Run between Detroit and Ann Arbor. Albert Kahn, the famous industrial architect and planner who was known for his designs of American automobile factories, designed the complex with Ford. The plant covered almost 4.75 million square feet. The plant was built with the aid of floodlights so that construction crews could work past nightfall. Again, that was very innovative back in the day. Back in the 1940s, if you think of pomp and circumstance and how popular movies were because that was all new. And you think of the lights when you went to a brand new release. They had, countless floodlights that they actually brought in from California to help light the facility so they could work at night. An automated floor drive carried the big planes along as they took shape with overhead conveyors and cranes adding various components. So they literally threw, if you think about that, 4.7 million 5 square foot with an automated belt system going through the whole thing, just progressively moving it along. And you had cranes and people manually doing things like this nonstop. The total length of all the assembly lines at the Willow Run plant was almost 5,000 feet, basically a mile-long plant. The finished planes literally flew directly from the plant to the Army Air Force bases using an airstrip that had been built at the plant specifically for that purpose and initiative alone. The first fully assembled B-24 came off the line on September 10th of 1942. So, as I mentioned, Ford was one of that built the B-24 bombers. So, if you think about this, at that time, a car had approximately 15,000 parts back then, but a B-24 had 153,000 parts. So when Ford was brought into the picture of building the B-24s, they had difficulty getting precise, accurate blueprints, which were truly needed to design the tools for mass production. You got to think about, here's Ford and their advanced, and they bring in, basically a skeleton, set of whatever to build. So what they did is they sat down with the original manufacturer of the B-24, which was Consolidated Aircraft of San Diego, California. They did not match many tools for mass production specs, so Ford revised the blueprints with them, which were really inadequate for scaling, and then that's how they really took it to a whole new level. So Ford engineers took apart a B-24 as well and made precise blueprint of those parts. So they were working with the previous manufacturer and the blueprints there, and then they had someone literally dismantling a B-24 and making prints from that stuff too. So Ford tool makers had both the experience and the equipment for making the dies required for precision manufacturing and the essentials for mass production. So we're talking about massive amounts of people. We're talking about massive amounts of output. At the same time now, we have a war effort going on. So there's a massive labor shortage. During this period of time, approximately 8,200 men were being drafted on a monthly basis into the war effort. In 1942, the United States conducted the fourth of 6 draft registrations for World War II, which was known as the Old Man Draft. This registration included men who were between the ages of 45 and 64. So we had younger gentlemen going into the war, and there wasn't enough, so now we're going into our matured class of men. So Ford came up with a solution. They established an aircraft apprentice school, got the government on board, and so this was a locally established a facility near the factory, which educated and prepared 8,000 students per week. So Ford's like, listen, if we're going to do this, we got to have people too. You know, because again, it was all about getting the stuff to the front line so that we could win. So the school's purpose was to prepare the men and women of the workforce for the job ahead of them. By the time production began in the fall of 1942, there were almost 20,000 graduates from that school already. So additional workers were also needed by Ford, making employment at the facility around 42,000, with 25% of them being women. Speaking of, our national icon from back in the day, Rosie the Riveter.
Yes.
Was she real? She was. Rosie the Riveter is both a romantic and a heroic figure from the World War II era. Rosie the Riveter is the muscle-flexing woman exclaiming, "We can do it," in the famous World War II poster. She has become an icon not only for women who kept the U.S. manufacturing facilities and factories rolling during wartime, but for all women of strength and determination. The original Rosie was a Ford employee from Ford's Willow Run bomber plant named Rose Will Monroe. The history of Rosie the Riveter begins when Monroe became the nation's poster girl for women joining the labor force during World War II. And again, that was very popular. Tons of posters, tons of ads, tons of propaganda, pulling at whatever your heartstrings were and whatever needs and whatever got you to participate. So the term Rosie was taken from her first name, came to symbolize all women who continued to fill what had previously been men's factory jobs, maintaining the company's labor force as thousands of men fought overseas. During peak production at the Willow Run assembly plant, up to 1/3 of the workforce consisted of women. Rose Will Monroe, on the Willow Run assembly line building B-29 and B-24 Liberator military planes. While on duty, she caught the eyes of a Hollywood producer. Again, here's a Hollywood producer at the facility. What they were doing is they were looking to cast the part for a riveter for a promotional film encouraging Americans to go buy war bonds. Her exposure in that film resulted in the popular "We Can Do It" poster by Howard J. Miller that you see in the picture here. And that is actually Rosie in the picture down there as well. So she was real, she was from Michigan, she did work for Ford. So now we're going to talk a little bit about what other things was Ford doing at the time. And again, they had this program and initiative called In Service of America. So gliders were motorless aircraft which were crucial for the success of many major invasions, such as the D-Day Allied invasion on the beaches of Normandy, as well as invasions of Italy, Sicily, and New Guinea. During World War II, Ford Motor Company retooled its sawmill complex in Iron Mountain, Michigan, to produce a wooden Waco CG-4A glider for the U.S. Army. The gliders were made of wood, steel, and cloth and were used to transport troops, cargo, equipment, and up to 13 soldiers to the front lines. The gliders were silent and could be landed by a pilot or co-pilot. So it's crazy when you see this stuff in motion. They would be loaded with, again, I've seen small bulldozers, all kinds of armaments, people, a co-pilot and a regular pilot, and they're attached to a bomber. They get into the area where they're going to go, they get released, and they glide in. It's amazing. And I haven't got true numbers, but the unfortunate death rate, because they had nothing, they were just, again, gliding and landing. So you could control it, but you could control it a certain degree, because if you think of a glider with that many people alone, it's like a lead balloon. So they're trying to glide it in, and in essence, they were just falling. So Ford's Iron Mountain plant was part of a large sawmill complex in Michigan's Upper Peninsula. The company's existing infrastructure, including lumber mills in the UP, and a large factory in Iron Mountain allowed Ford to build gliders efficiently. By 1942, the plant was able to produce 8 gliders per day, operating 24 hours a day with 3 8-hour shifts. In total, Ford produced over 4,000 gliders, more than any other production facility in the United States. The gliders were widely used by the U.S. Army, especially during the D-Day invasion of Normandy in June of 1944. So if you ever get up to Iron Mountain, there is an actual World War II museum. I cannot stress to you enough, excuse my language, how badass that place is. It's a phenomenal museum, and they have a full-scale glider in there. So when you actually see this in person, it just changes your perception on everything. It really does. But I highly encourage you. The other cool thing that they didn't bring up, that plant actually made the wood for the Woody cars. So back in the day, a lot of that wood came from Iron Mountain, Michigan. Jeeps. Jeeps were huge. The Army needed an all-terrain vehicle, and in 1940, Ford and Willys developed plans plus an original prototype. The oldest Ford Jeep in existence is on display at the U.S. Veterans Memorial Museum in Huntsville, Alabama. Ford invested over $4 million in the Jeep program and began producing the general purpose, or as they were referred to, the GP, soon be called Jeep. So instead of GP initials, it became Jeep. That's how that name came about through Ford. A lot of controversy with the other Jeep and how the name came about there too. There were 1,500 built by the spring of 1941. Over the next 4 years, more than 300,000 Ford Jeeps were built by the military. So think about that, 300,000 Ford Jeeps on top of everything else. As the war continued, Ford made many innovations with the Jeep, including a lower profile, stronger frame, improved fuel tank design, and other things. And then there's the other Jeep, the amphibian Jeep. The Army needed an all-terrain vehicle, and in 1940, Ford and Willys developed plans to also develop another prototype. The Army was so impressed by what was going on, they asked Ford to develop the amphibious model. So amphibious Jeeps were assembled at the company's Rouge factory. Though it shared parts with the land-only GP Jeep, the amphibious GPA version had a longer wheelbase and weighed about 800 pounds more. Ford built 12,781 amphibious Jeeps from 1942 to 1943 and were highly effective during the war near Sicily and the South Seas. So when I saw this is a real eye-opener, because this really talks about Ford's contributions to the war effort. So Ford made a total of 52 distinct items ranging from bombers to motors. Ford also contributed more than $18 million worth of engineering assets, production assets, research resources for use by other manufacturers during the war effort. So not only were they doing all of this stuff, more than $18 million at that time worth of resources dedicated to other entities. Again, all about Allied victory. Ford led the domestic charge in the manufacturing of high-powered aircraft engines, and from early 1944 through the end of the war, Ford was the leading producer of large bombers and gliders, as we have spoke about. The Ford GAA engines were used in tanks manufactured by Ford, and then as well as Chrysler and General Motors in latter years. So Ford got the contract for the motor. They made the tanks for X amount of time, and then Chrysler got that contract afterwards. So to carry on, the global enterprise. Some pretty amazing numbers here. So in addition to the massive effort in the United States, and this goes back to me talking about the other plants they had set up around the world, Ford of Britain, 13,900 tracked vehicles, 184,600 wheeled vehicles, 262,000 V8 engines, 137,500 tractors. Ford of Canada, 380,000 military vehicles, including universal carriers, trucks, artillery tractors, transport units, and scout cars. Ford of India, 122,400 military vehicles. Ford of South Africa, 34,900 military vehicles, including cars, trucks, and delivery wagons. Then we have Ford of New Zealand, 5,200 military vehicles, including trucks, staff cars, and tractors. 5,720,500 grenades. 2,370,500 mortar shells. 1,448,200 ordnance fuses. So you think about that, 1940 to 1945. Ford already had all this in motion. It's astronomical of the vision of Henry Ford and the people that he employed. So Ford plant produced products. In the service of America, as I've mentioned, the Ford Motor Company gave all of its knowledge, experience, and resources to help bring resolve to both of the world wars. Although Ford is well known for contributions like Jeeps, they had an Eagle anti-submarine patrol boat, B-24 Liberators, M4 Sherman tanks, aircraft engines, and much, much, much more throughout both world wars. The automotive giant used precision manufacturing methods, practices, innovative designs, and visionary procedures to increase both quantity and quality, while also lowering overall production costs of every single item they produced. The vault. So Ford, because again of their history, and you know when they started talking about this, obviously they were coming up on their 150th anniversary. So Ford created what's called the Heritage Vault. It's a free online database of archival material for journalists, car enthusiasts, and just fans of the company. The Vault's goal is to be a one-stop shop for all things Ford, and to make it easy for people to discover the company's history from anywhere in the world. The Vault includes searchable artifacts that can be downloaded for personal use, such as production history from the 1900s up to 2003, Ford and Lincoln vehicles, brochures from the 70s, the 80s, news releases, location photos from around the world, and much, much more. And if anybody ever has an interest, you can just look up Ford Heritage Vault, and it does come up. So since the launch, Ford has had over 1.5 million downloads from this site, which equates to approximately 5,000 assets per day. And they continuously add more content. So it's been, it was really fascinating for me when I finally got in front of the right people. Again, they were super excited about this. And at the time, to be, not that it was anything great on my part, but for them to literally give me access to their national archives and to release pictures that had never been released to the public, it was pretty cool. So now we're going to get into our tank. Everybody doing all right so far? Okay. So this picture is going to come into play here in a second. So as it mentioned in the original video, or the first video, the name Sherman comes from British tradition of naming its American-produced tanks after American Civil War generals. So named after General William Tecumseh Sherman, the name quickly caught on in the United States, which soon adopted the practice of naming all of its tanks after generals. So the M4A3, and this is why this picture is important. So the crew consisted of a commander, a loader, a gunner, a driver, and an assistant driver. So you think about, we're in this room and we're all sitting close to each other, but think of 5 people literally right here. And it gives you a different appreciation for many aspects of a war. Because when you were in a tank, it didn't matter where you were at, you were being targeted from the ground, you were being targeted from the air. I mean, you were a sitting duck nonstop. The speed, sustained speed at level ground was 26 miles per hour, and that was advanced. The engine was the Ford GAA V8, 4-cycle 8-cylinder. It weighed 68,000 pounds, and the armament was one 75 millimeter main gun, two 30 caliber machine guns, and one 50 cal machine gun. So in some of the pictures, like I'll pop up here, you're going to see a guy sitting up, just popping up, and that's what those guys were doing. So, serial number, serialization. The tank in South Boardman, our serial number is 2662. It also has a U.S. registration number, and the date built was August of 1942. So based upon archival data and according to the serial number, our tank in South Boardman is the oldest Ford M4A3 tank known to exist. And I'll explain why that is. So the first Ford M4A3 came off the assembly line in June of 1942. There were no tanks built in July. So the serial number 2662 was the 7th M4A3 produced at the Highland Park plant in August of 1942, making it the 8th tank of 1,692 tanks built by Ford. So as I mentioned, Ford pioneered the use of the GAA V8 Ford engine. Another cool thing about our tank is actually not only the oldest according to serial number left, but it is one of, I think, 2 in the entire world that actually has the motor left in it. So when our tank was delivered in South Boardman, it was fully operable. There's some stories of joy rides and other things. The top, because of that, was ultimately welded. But when it was basically parked, our transmission, the motor, and everything is still inside of it. So that's why a lot of people were very concerned that if Ford came and got our tank, that it wasn't coming back. So because the Ford M4A3 tanks were produced at a time in World War II when the U.S. Army had already standardized, as I mentioned, on the M4 and the M4A1, those had Continental-built radial aircraft engines, so again, very hot, very big. They were initially, so all the Ford tanks were initially kept in the United States. So after the Battle of the Bulge, we lost a slew of tanks. Then the Ford tanks went over to Europe. The cool thing is our tank didn't go anywhere. It stayed at Ford. So when you look at the design of the initial tanks, so for example, when you look at, compared to the other M4 tanks, very sleek, very ergonomical. The glacis, which is the angle, is completely different than all of the M4 Sherman tanks that were more rounded, because they were doing studies of artillery hitting and coming in. You know, a tank that's more rounded, you have more of a direct impact. If there's an angle, the thought was it'd come in and at least deflect instead of taking a direct hit. But what they found out through the testing is even though advancements were made and we were building these things out of steel, keep in mind I had mentioned they were building these or cutting them out with water jet, technology. So what they ended up doing, because again you go back, you've got someone sitting here, you've got someone sitting here, you've got someone sitting here. So if you see a lot of pictures where these massive plates are on the side of the tanks, that's the reason why. So when you go to South Boardman and you look at our tank, at the top of it and on the sides, you look at the passes of weld from when they put these huge patches on. It's crazy. If any of the guys or ladies are familiar with oil field stuff, oil field casing has very heavy welds, and that's exactly what it looks like. So, a lot of the tanks, as I mentioned, went to the Battle of the Bulge. The Battle of the Bulge started in December 16th of 1944, and it lasted to January 16th, 1945. So, when I mentioned the front glacis, Ford decided that 57 degrees was like the magic number, and it really did throughout the war help deflect enemy artillery. Now, besides the steel plates, the cool thing about our tank is because it stayed at Ford throughout the years, everything that they were doing from an innovation standpoint, our tank has on it. There were things taken on or put on and taken off, and some of it remains. Some of it you could see where they had other stuff welded. It's really cool to look at. So the later, larger hatched tanks got away from that problem even more by reducing the glacis angle to 47 degrees, which then eliminated the protruding hatch bulges and at the same time reduced overall ballistic protection. So what Ford did really set the tone for what happened with tanks in the future too. So where did our tank come from? How did we get it? Back then, I was explaining this a little bit earlier, things were more accessible. Culture was different. Visions were different. People took pride in things differently than they do. So when the Legion was built in Boardman, there was a group of veterans that, again, were either tied to the Army, were involved with the Army, still had connections in the Army, and they had to do a bunch of paperwork, but ultimately, that's how our tank came to be. There was a lot of paperwork, and is there anything else that you can think of that I'm missing on that?
No, I think that one of the main people behind bringing it to town, some people might not recognize the name of Eamon Hogerheim. Eamon was one of the big drivers, was a member of the Legion at the time. He was one of the big drivers to get it into town.
Yeah.
What was that time frame?
So our tank was actually delivered to Camp Grayling on July 11th, 1958. So it's interesting. In today's world, the Army has divisions. It's called TACOM is one of the divisions. TACOM is Tanks and Armament Command. They manage. So anywhere you're traveling in the United States, if it's a Legion post or VFW or a park, if you see some type of, 50 cal or a tank or whatever, if it was on the ground, TACOM still manages that inventory. So we have to do certain things with the Army to keep our tank there. They could literally come and get it if it was neglected, even though it's been there forever and things have been signed off. So over the years, when the war ended, again, think of technology here, there was a facility that the Army utilized called the Rock Island Arsenal. It was a subordinate location of TACOM. It was previously managed by record keeping on index cards. The Rock Island facility actually burnt at one point in time, so all of that archival information was gone. So there is a period where we really did not know, we don't know the history of the tank from the time it ended at Ford to the time it was delivered to Camp Grayling. What's interesting is we had been trying to figure these details out. Like when did it get delivered, when did it come? Because at that point in time, I had progressed enough where we were refurbishing the tank. Anne, who is part of our auxiliary at the Legion Post in Boardman, had been diving into notes and record keeping and things for a very long period of time. We were literally out power washing the tank. Anne comes out and says, I found it. She found the information of when our tank was delivered. Ironically enough, and this is crazy, it was delivered to us on the weekend of July 28th, 1958. The same weekend we were refurbishing the tank. Pretty cool. So, over the years, the government and the Army has also changed how they manage. So even though you've got TACOM, and you've got the other division that manages like things that were in the air, helicopters, jets, things of that nature. Back in 1980, our tank actually had a deed created for it, and there was a U.S. serial number associated with it back in 2001. So I've worked with TACOM for I don't even know how many hours diving through this stuff, and they've been great to work with. So we actually have a letter from the Department of the Army requesting that the National Guard in Grayling fill out a certificate of limited demilitarization, and then it needed to come and get inspected. So from 1958 up until the early 2000s and the 1980s, there was these things happening intermittently. So there's lots of gaps of avoided information. But what's really interesting is the gentleman from the National Guard who came over to do the testing was none other than our local Colonel Nelson J. Cannon. So if everybody knows Jerry Cannon, he was our sheriff in Kalkaska County. So Jerry has since retired, and he retired as a major general. And I've talked to him about this a few times, and he slightly remembers doing all that. So that's really, in the grand scheme of things, kind of the quick history of our tank, and that's my presentation. I sincerely thank you all. And if you haven't been down to South Boardman, go take a look at the tank. It's fascinating. And if you look up like M1s, M4s, look at the suspension. So I'm going to go through a few pictures here just to explain a few more things. So these pictures, again, these were the images that had never been released to the public by Ford. So these are the testing grounds down there. Now what you see on the M4s that was dynamically different. The whole suspension, you had suspension in a different manner, how the sprocket was driven. And so like I said, pull up on the internet and look at M4s, M3s, M1s. They look like dinosaurs compared to this tank. They really do. And again, you can tell that these were one of the first early ones because they're very clean, very modern looking. They really hadn't been exposed to a lot of testing yet. But again, what Ford did and what they were creating back in early 1940s is just fascinating.
If you happen to know anybody who grew up in South Boardman in the 40s and 50s, they may have gotten a ride in the tank, because when they brought the tank to town, before the gentleman took it for a joyride, they did give rides to the kids in town. And my mom was one of the kids who got to have a ride in it.
What's kind of cool in this the testing pictures too, if you look at the three guys in that tank, they're all wearing like old school football helmets. Like that was their testing stuff. It would not fly in today's world.
Why did the tank never leave the States?
We just, again, I say we. It's just for whatever reason that they still needed tanks to remain for testing, and our tank had been one that was just continuously used and not put into production. So I get asked all the time, why didn't you put markings on the tank? Our tank was never deployed. It was never commissioned. It was never tied to a unit. It was never blank. So when I wanted to redo it, I wanted to redo it to what it was and how it served. And that's why it is just green. So some cool stuff as I was diving into this. Back in 1942, as all of this stuff was happening, there were a lot of things going on with the government. And, looking at the military, I mean, here we are, we're just getting into the war, World War II at that time, of course. And so there were a lot of things that needed to be revamped from World War I. We're in a different setting, we're doing different things, there's different theaters, and so a lot of cool stuff as I was diving in during COVID. Like I said, this project was 4.5 years for me. I spent a lot of time during COVID, and I found out that, a lot of the World War I and early World War II vehicles had no white on them at all. They were in blue. But what was happening is, at night, through binoculars, they couldn't pick up the blue from the olive drab. So that is how white came to be. And there is a series and progression for all of the details, the numbers, etc., where they're located, how high and how tall they are, and things of that nature. So very, very fascinating. But in 1942, the military spec for all vehicles was olive drab. So with my job, I'm involved with a lot of companies that do, you get into different paints and inks and things of that nature. And I knew some companies that produce military grade paint. I had zero clue as to how many different types, even in today's world, of military paint exists. And even the companies making them. Back in the day, that was top security. You didn't know who the manufacturers were, etc. And I found out that the paint used back then on our tank had hexavalent chromium in it. So I originally wanted to sandblast the tank, and after I found out it had hexavalent chromium, that was a no-no. You get that in your lungs and you're done. So that changed my course of, okay, here we have a tank that is now 80 years old. What am I going to do to get it back down to a surface that allows me to, basically refurbish it? And so I spent a lot of time talking to paint companies, and the paint that's used today has, still, again, think of progression, the Gulf War, Iraq, the desert. You have all kinds of different additives and coatings and surfaces that the military has gone through and changed and adapted based upon the variables. And so today, the paint, for a gallon of some of this paint, we're talking thousands of dollars. And here I'm working on a budget that I'm basically funding myself. So fortunately, through all of the networking and things that I was doing, I got hooked up with a company that is making parts and making specifics. They're doing some vehicles or vehicle components like doors and things of that nature, but they're doing a lot of repair stuff. So they were using the current grade of paint. So I had great conversations. The plant manager was phenomenal, and I shared what we were doing, and he said, "I'll tell you what, we'll donate the paint. You take care of my guy," because that was the other thing too. I've done painting. I've worked on vehicles, hobby, passion, whatever. So I'm familiar with taking things down to bare metal and how you prep it, how you paint it, the surface coatings and things with plastics and all that. And I said, okay, what viscosity do I need to mix this to, and what are we using for primer? And he looked at me and said, "You're not going to want to know any of that stuff." He said, "You take care of my guy, we'll take care of your guy." So the plant manager, the guy he was talking about, was actually his son, and he's worked for the company for 22 years. So the paint that is on our tank is current color, and it has the infrared stuff in it that they're using on vehicles today. It doesn't have all the chemical resistant additives, but it has UV and infrared protection on it. So if you had infrared glasses and you went over to our tank at night, you won't see it. It'll line up. And what was really cool is, as we were refurbishing it, so we power washed it, we degreased it, did a number of different processes to get it down to as close to bare metal as we could. And it worked, because the years of oxidation and everything, it was crazy. I mean, we walked out of there looking like, if anybody are familiar with Land of the Lost back in the day with the slee stacks, that was us. That was us. But it was fun. We had a great crew, just a ton of people that helped. But the primer today, it's some type of zinc blank 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 primer. And it is specifically designed to bond in a different way molecularly to the paint itself. And that was an interesting process. Super tacky primer. And when you were spraying the infrared, as we were progressing through the tank, it was changing shades of green and brown and red, and that was the infrared as it was drying. And it dried same color. So just absolutely phenomenal. So I'll just go through some of these pictures again here. And yeah.
Who produces most of the tanks right now for us?
That's a good question. To be frank, I don't even know. There's so many. It's changed because there's so many civilian contracted companies today that it's spread all over the place.
Does Ford do anything that you're aware of?
Not that I'm aware of.
Okay.
Not that I'm aware of. So, in talking on World War II, I had an opportunity here a couple weeks ago to go down to Muskegon. They had a air over type of show down there, and they had a lot of World War II stuff. But one of the things that a lot of people don't know, and I highly recommend this, if you guys ever want to go down to Muskegon, we have a World War II submarine that actually was served. It was more in the Pacific Rim in the Philippines, and for that type of sub, there are only 2 of them in the entire world that actually still operate. There's one at Pearl Harbor, and there's ours in Muskegon. And you go down there, there's a 2-story museum, very modern, very, very impressive. And when you're walking into it, you have 5 full-length torpedoes right there for the viewing. And I'd never been in front of a torpedo that close. I had no clue to the girth, the size, the weight, the manufacturing. And then inside the museum, they have it cut open so you can actually see the gearing and the workmanship and how it worked. But you get to tour the submarine as well. And so when you go in the sub, both in the front and the back, in the front they had 6 torpedo bays. Here's the torpedo bay, here were the bunks, here's where the guys slept. Your head was right at the torpedo bay. Right next to you, if you're on the top bunk, you're hugging a torpedo all night long. And on the bottom bunk, there's the other torpedo. So during the night, if you're sleeping, they showed how the bunks roll up, torpedoes come down, go into the launch tubes, and boom. So that's on both the front and the back. But what really fascinated me is not only the workmanship, but you take a submarine and how much space you're lacking. Crazy. And over the years, it gives you also a perception of how small people were back then. There's uniforms that you look like that you look at of full adult males, and that's like a sixth grader today. It just changes your psyche on everything. But one of the things that really caught my attention as we worked our way through the submarine, all the different types of materials. There was bronze, there was copper, there was different types of plastic that was non-conductive or lightweight or resistance to this. And then there was, again, the amount of steel. The amount of steel in just one submarine just blows your mind. But I encourage you, if you ever get a chance, go down. There's another World War II museum down there too that's also on a naval ship. So, it's an hour and a half, 2 hours away, and it's worth its weight in gold as far as what you glean. Yes, sir.
They also prepared a landing craft down there. They show movies.
It's amazing. My brother and I at the air show, we got a chance to actually go up in a Huey. And again, that'll change your life. Yeah, Craig.
Yeah, my grandpa, Doyle Huff, my mom's dad, he was in the Navy in World War II. Matter of fact, he had just turned 17 when he went in to the service, and he was put on the Tautog, which was boat 199 submarine. So, in his war patrols, he did 3 war patrols in the Pacific. In one of them, he was out. Both subs were together.
Yep.
One being the Tautog, and the other one is the Silver
The
Sides.
Silver Sides.
The Silver Sides is the one down in the ski.
Yep.
He said there was a Jap, as he would say it, bomber coming in on him. And he dropped bombs, and they landed between the 2 subs that were there up on, and he's like, he doesn't know why they didn't rack him with machine guns.
Right.
Or why the bomber didn't rack him up. But as soon as he saw that plane, he yelled at him and they started submerging. But anyways, Grandpa stayed in the service for a while. So not only he was with the Tautog when it went into Manistee to get the engines out of it, and I must say the 50 caliber or the 20 mil or the 20 mil gun, or no, the 40 is at Manistee at the post. So he brought that sub in, and he also brought in the Silver Sides out of Chicago.
Okay.
So when you go down to Memorial Day, this is getting off course, I'm sorry, but Decoration Day, Memorial Day, they'd always have the old submariners down there, lined up with a group of chairs up front by the submarine. There's the Silver Sides. Grandpa was like, let's say a celebrity, because on the submariners, on the back of their jacket, their uniform or their what they wear to show that they were in the subs, has a list of either a submarine or multiple submarines. In my case, my grandpa has 4 submarine names on the back of his, which one of them being the Silver Sides.
Silver Sides, yeah.
So you would go into that sub with him, and that Silver Sides was identical to the Tautog, which sank, at one time it had sank the most Japanese ships of any during the war.
Yeah.
It was ranked number 1. I think it's ranked number 2 now because they did some looking in the 1980s. But anyways, he still claimed that it's number 1.
It's
but anyways,
fascinating.
so you go in that sub with him, and everybody was following him around because he could say what it was like and how the depth charges were coming down. And then I remember that time I was there with him. The submariners, the old boys from World War II, get to start the engine.
Yep, right.
They asked, they said, Doyle, you ready to start that engine? He's like, no, I'm gonna let my grandson do it. So I was able to start the engine on that World War II sub, so that's pretty cool.
That's phenomenal. Yeah, they actually start that sub twice a year.
Yeah.
So I say fully operational. They do start it twice a year. So yeah, I encourage anybody to go down there. It's
So Dad
fascinating.
gave a tour, we all went down for that ceremony, and he gave a tour, because there wasn't a tour guide, but my dad had been on it, so,
Yeah.
you know, like, it was fascinating, but I told him, I said, Dad, how could you be in this sub? And he said, we just wore our skivvies.
Yeah, you had so much heat, and again, they would be down. I mean, you think about that. Again, think about this confined space like right here. They would be underwater for up to 5 months at times. 2 months was average, but it just absolutely crazy. And nothing but pure respect. Nothing but pure respect. And again, as I shared during the presentation last year when we had in South Boardman, it's one of the reasons why I love to do this, because it's always important to re-educate. In today's world, kids going to school do not learn this like we did, like you guys did. It's important to remember, reflect, appreciate the whole 9 yards. Because
One more thing, there was an old boy from Fife Lake here that had worked down at the factories in World War II.
Okay.
Earl Delancey.
Oh yeah, I
Some of
remember
you
that
guys
name.
might remember him, but I can't remember, because I remember him when I worked at Hayes with Don Crawford there, that he would talk about sometimes about him working downstate during the war, and I can't remember if he was working at a tank plant or a bomber plant. I think it might have been one of the bomber plants, but anyways, that's where he was
That's
working during the war.
fascinating. Yeah.
The other thing, Paul, is the human aspect of it. Dad said that there were times when they would sink the ships, you know,
Mhm.
that they would take Japanese on board on the sub.
Okay.
But he said we never, what he told me was that they never mistreated them,
Yep.
that they took him, but he was underneath the North Sea once, and, the sub caught fire. And they were down, you know,
Wow.
and he said they didn't know what they were gonna do, but they managed to get it crippled up, and they got back to the States with it. But he was never the same. Now we know PTSD.
Oh right, for sure.
But back then, it was, who knew?
Yeah.
Who knew what it was? But Grandma said when he was a young boy, he always loved the water, and him and Uncle Wayne built a sub and took it out in the lake and sunk it and almost drowned. Yeah.
Well, again, thank you guys, and my pure thankfulness and appreciation for, again, everything you guys are doing for Fife Lake and the Historical Society. I'm proud to grow up here, and I always preach it, and I preach Northern Michigan all the time, and it's phenomenal what you guys are doing.
I wanna go to Muskegon and Iron Mountain. and-
Yes.
Are there-
Sound off. 3, 4, cadence count. 1, 2.